Welcome, everyone. This is Espresso Chats, a podcast by Commonfund Institute, where we deliver short, strong shots of governance and leadership insight. For our inaugural episode, we want to briefly introduce ourselves and what we're bringing to the podcast. I'm George Suttles, Executive Director of the Commonfund Institute, and Commonfund has been providing governance and leadership insights for 50 plus years. Commonfund Institute is the education and research arm of Commonfund. Commonfund is an asset management firm in the endowment space, founded in 1971 with a seed grant from the Ford Foundation. Our firm manages customized investment programs for endowments, foundations, and other mission-driven institutions. So now you can see why we are considered a trusted source for investment governance best practices across the country and across the globe, to be honest with you. We spend time on the road with constituents and are hearing the chatter about what matters most to institutional investors. And now, obviously, it's 2025, so we need a podcast.
Hey, everyone. I'm Amanda Novello, Senior Policy and Research Analyst at Commonfund Institute, and I'm excited to co-host some great guests and help listeners make sense of what's going on and how your institution can navigate everything. Almost equally, I'm excited to drink espresso and chat, and maybe even sprinkle in some puns, but that might be a tall order. How do you
Thanks,
like that?
Amanda. That was good. I like that. I like that a lot. Thanks, Amanda. Joining us for our first episode of Espresso Chats is Tim Yates, President and CEO of Commonfund OCIO. We are absolutely thrilled. Tim agreed to join us, especially given how busy he's been helping clients navigate a challenging terrain facing the nonprofit sector in the U.S. Tim, welcome.
Thanks, George, and thank you, Amanda. It's a great honor and privilege to partner with you all, as always, and especially for the first inaugural Espresso Chat podcast. Although I didn't get my cup of coffee or shot of espresso in my office location.
Well, we'll get you a gift card after the after the show. Thanks, Tim. Tim, let's jump right in. There's been a wide-reaching attack on education in the U.S. this year. The Department of Education is arguably being dismantled. Major grant funding has been paused or pulled entirely, and high-profile institutions like Harvard and Columbia seem to be test cases for broader political actions, not to mention the endowment tax, which we'll spend a little bit of time talking about. So, question for you, how are you making sense of this moment? And for the listeners, should institutions take a wait-and-see approach, or is there something they should be facing head-on? How should we be thinking about tackling these issues, especially in higher ed?
Well, thanks, George. It is certainly, without question, an interesting time for higher ed, and there's been a lot thrown at us in the last several months. But before I try to make sense of this moment, let me start with a couple of important caveats. The first is, as you discussed in your opening, Commonfund is an investment manager. We're charged with managing endowment portfolios that will hopefully generate returns over the long term that support the missions of our nonprofit investors. And I say that only because as an investment manager, we try to leave all of our political views at home and make investment decisions really based on economic conditions, on capital market conditions, on risk return opportunities, and so on. And so while the political environment no doubt influences these things, Commonfund as an institution tries to stay out of the broader political discourse. We leave a lot of that work to partners like Nakubo and others. So that's caveat number one. Caveat number two would be that while Harvard has certainly captured the attention of the current administration, and perhaps, as a result, all of our attention, it's only one institution. It's definitely the oldest, founded in 1636, so almost 140 years before the country was founded. And it's definitely the wealthiest, with an endowment in excess of 50 billion. But again, it's only one institution. There are 6,000 colleges and universities in the US, and those institutions, both private like Harvard and public, serve more than 19 million students. And so I don't raise this to minimize what's going on at Harvard. I think what's going on at Harvard is profoundly important to higher ed, and I would argue to our country and society as well. But I want to make sure that we keep in mind that there are 5,999 other institutions of higher ed, and we shouldn't paint this picture with just one brush or in one color, I guess, George, in this case, crimson, if you will. And as you always say, if you know and understand one nonprofit, one college, or one university, you know and understand exactly, one college or one university. And let me give you an example of why I raised this. We manage, as an OCIO, so as an outsourced chief investment officer, over $10 billion of endowment funds on behalf of 59 higher education institutions. These institutions range from community colleges in Texas and California to foundations that support state universities in Montana and Florida to private colleges in New England. And just this past weekend, I had the great privilege of attending a board retreat for one of the support foundations we work with in Georgia. So this is a foundation that fundraises in support of a large state university system. That system educates over 45,000 students. And this retreat was all about the success of this foundation and the university and the success that they've had. They've raised over $50 million in the last 5 years, largely in support of financial aid, and nearly doubled the size of their endowment. Enrollment was up 6% last year and has increased for 6 consecutive years. So I share this example simply to really illustrate that while Harvard certainly feels under attack at the moment, there are literally thousands of experiences that may not look like what's happening at Harvard. And so with all those caveats, I guess I'm finally getting around to sort of actually answering your question, which was, how are you making sense of this moment? And I would say it's really hard to make sense of it all. The two big news items currently, the freezes and cuts in federal funding or grants for research, and the proposed increase in the endowment tax, both of which will impact Harvard as well as some other large research universities. Those two things, while sort of in the news all the time, don't have a huge impact on the 59 colleges and universities that we work with. They don't receive hundreds of millions of dollars in research grants, and most are below the currently proposed threshold for the endowment tax. So don't get me wrong. I know we're going to discuss the endowment tax in a minute. But I do think, these things are profoundly consequential to the institutions that are impacted by them. It's just not impacting our clients at the moment. What I am focused on, though, which I do think will be far more consequential to the majority of the higher ed institutions we work with, and likely the thousands of colleges and universities beyond the Ivy League, are three things. One, what's happening with regard to international students. Two, the proposed concept of risk sharing, where colleges and universities would be on the financial hook for federally issued student loans. And three, the proposed or potential changes to Pell Grants and other student funding. And all of this is happening against a backdrop that was already challenged by a structural decline in the demographic picture and a looming, the proverbial demographic cliff. And so I'm happy to chat about all of these, George, but I also recognize that you branded this as an espresso shot and not a full, cup of coffee. So I fear that I'm already pushing the limits. So I'll pause there.
No, but Tim, I appreciate that, because it really is about, sort of us understanding the nuances, the multidimensional context in which we're trying to navigate and do this work. And then what I really like is that you lifted up a win. Right? That there are colleges and universities, although they're monitoring what's happening in the public policy landscape at the federal level very closely, there are still wins to be had. There are still strategic opportunities in higher ed to be taken advantage of. So I really appreciate that.
Exactly. There's a lot of good stories out there.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Amanda, I want to turn to you because Tim mentioned a couple of things that really resonated, and I want to make sure that we touch on them. What do we know or understand so far as it pertains to the House of Representatives legislation and the implications for institutional investors? Because as Tim mentioned, we're not political, but we do need to track that closely because it does impact our clients. So.
In terms of endowment specifically, the House of Representatives has passed a bill. It passed in the Senate and then signed by the president, would dramatically increase the scope of the current endowment tax on private higher education institutions. The current tax, implemented in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act during the first Trump administration, is 1.4% on net investment income at private institutions with at least 500 students and assets of more than 500,000 per student. Now, the new tiered structure that's currently up for review in the Senate, and there might be breaking news by the time we release this podcast, and we'll get there. We'll be on top of the details and disseminating that information as it comes. But what's being reviewed now would start at 1.4%, the current level, and that rate would step up for institutions with more and more endowment dollars per student, and top out at 21% of net investment income for endowments with more than 2 million per student, which would essentially match the corporate tax rate on those small handful of institutions with the largest endowments. So as Tim mentioned, this applies to a small subset of schools. Estimates suggest the new tax rates would apply to around 45 to 50 institutions. There's a similar tax rate structure that would apply to private foundations under this law. And we've outlined these details and more in a recent post on commonfund.org that you can find on our site.
Thanks so much, Amanda. So Tim, Amanda shared a lot there. There's a lot to unpack, but fundamentally, how are you and the investment teams at Commonfund helping clients even scenario plan around implications for this new tax regime, right? So even if it's not going to have an impact, or it's only going to impact a small subset in higher ed, I know clients must say, well, let's do a little bit of scenario planning. Let's, think about what the implications are if this tax regime were to expand and impact more colleges. So I know you're helping folks think a lot about that. So just unpack a little bit of that for us in terms of what Amanda shared.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of questions there. I'll try to be succinct, but I missed this in the prep session, but just one small nuance is that the current tax law from 2017 applied to 500,000 assets per student and institutions that enroll at least 500 tuition-paying students. And because there's a couple of institutions that have very large endowments where no one pays tuition, and so they're exempt under the current law. But you asked sort of what the impact would be as currently drafted. There wouldn't be any impact on most colleges and universities. I think you referenced 45, 50, 55. Last year there was something like 56 that were subject and paid the tax last year, and that's because their endowments were in excess of 500,000 per student threshold. So assuming that threshold remains, and that wasn't always the case. There was some threat a couple of months ago that would be lowered, but the current legislation has it remaining at 500,000. And there are some nuances with regard to that, including the exclusion now of international students in the calculation, as well as exemptions for religious institutions. So assuming all of that, roughly the same number of institutions would likely pay the tax next year, which means that the bulk of colleges and universities would not be subject to it. What is materially different, though, Amanda, which you raised, is the rate. And so 5 institutions would be in that 21% tax bucket: Harvard, Princeton, Yale, MIT, and Stanford. Now, it doesn't take a hedge fund quant, and we have those, George, but to calculate, even simple guys like you and I can calculate the impact that if you paid 1.4% on net investment income last year, and you're going to instead pay 21% next year, it's pretty material. So let's say Harvard paid $45 million last year when the rate was 1.4%. That tax is now going to be 15 times higher. So instead of 45 million, it's 675 million. That's 630 million that's not going to financial aid, not supporting students, not supporting the operations of the university. Grinnell College is a great example of this impact, opposite end of the spectrum from Harvard. It's a small college in the Midwest. It's in Iowa, small college with a big endowment, $2.7 billion endowment that equates to roughly 1.5 million per student. And that would put them in the 14% tax category, having been in the 1.4% up until now. That endowment, which has been built by the generosity of their donors over decades, as well as undoubtedly savvy investment and stewardship over the assets, supports 60% of their operating budget. 90% of their 1,700 students receive financial aid, and the college meets 100% of student need with no loans because of this great resource called their endowment. So this college, Grinnell, paid $2.4 million in taxes last year, and the potential cost under this new legislation would be in the $30 million range. That's on a total operating budget of $190 million. So anyone who's listening to this, who works with or even understands the finances of a small private college, you know that a $30 million hole in a $190 million operating budget is absolutely massive. And for some institutions, it could be existential in nature. So your second question is, how would or will some of these institutions think about investing their endowments if these increases in the tax rate actually come to pass or come to fruition? And I think a lot of that still remains to be seen. We need to keep in mind that the tax is not on the endowment value. It's on or assessed on the net investment income, which includes things like dividends and interest, but also realized gains. So they will all, absolutely have to start thinking about how to manage those things in a tax efficient manner, how to manage realized gains, how to think about tax efficiency from an investment perspective. But from a bigger picture perspective, I think the larger question is whether you target a higher level of return to offset the tax, or you reduce the payout or support to the university, and by extension, the students, because some amount of spending is being siphoned off by the federal government. And I think that's a big but not easy question from a governance standpoint to wrestle with. And again, I'm happy to get into more of that and what that might mean. Certainly a higher return objective would require taking more risk, likely in the form of equity or illiquidity. But again, we're drinking shots of espresso here and not the whole pot of coffee. So let me pause and leave it there, George.
I want to close us out here and just give you space to share some final thoughts with us. And let's lean into hope and strategy a little bit. What opportunities are you seeing for institutional investors as we all sort of navigate this together?
Yeah, I would say, George and Amanda, it's really easy to get wrapped up in the daily news flow, and it's what's happening is really important. I don't want to minimize it. I don't want to suggest that what's going on isn't important because it is. But we should all be mindful and ensure that it doesn't crowd out the time and attention and focus that we need to have on long-term strategy and on long-term thinking. Someone at the table has to still be thinking about what success looks like in 20 years and how that success will be achieved. And so, I think in this world of tweets or whatever they're called now, short-termism is prevalent, but it's not great for perpetual institutions of higher education, and it's definitely not great for the investment strategy of the perpetual pools of endowed assets that support those institutions. So I think making sure that we're at least balancing the sort of the news flow of today and the impact of all of that with the long-term development of a strategy that will ensure success for generations to come.
Awesome. I think that's a good place for us to close. Perspective, balance, and long-term institutional investors need to stay strategically focused on the long term. Tim Yates, my friend, thanks so much for joining us for the first Espresso Chats podcast. We really appreciate it. Tim, you were brilliant. Amanda, you were a delight. And as for me, I just tried not to embarrass us. So hopefully everybody stayed in their lane.
Thank you, George.
Thanks so much.
Great.
Thanks, Amanda. If you like this conversation and want to hear more from leaders in the field, please visit www.commonfund.org/Espresso Chats to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. Again, gratitude to our guest, Tim, for joining us. Amanda, thank you for co-hosting. I think we had a great time. We'll see you next episode. Bye, everyone.